We will definitely come to the question how geopolitics will shape cybersecurity and how cybersecurity will reshape geopolitics. And to answer these questions, I have distinguished guests with me, and I invite Despina Spanu up towards the stage, who is the head of the cabinet of the Vice President of the European Commission, and she worked on various security-related issues as the NIS directive and the implementation of the European Union strategy of 2020-25. Hello, Despina, nice to have you here. You can also clap your hands. Thank you. The next speaker is Eva Ilves, who is the advisor to the government of Latvia and Riga, and she worked in various national and international institutions in NATO, in the EU, as advisor to the Secretary of State. Hello, Eva, how are you? Then we have Caroline Busch, a senior manager at Atos, a company that focuses on high-tech communications, cloud, big data, cybersecurity, and all the fancy topics that are relevant here. Welcome, Caroline. And last but not least, we have Paul Morillas, who is the director of the Barcelona Center of International Affairs, political scientist by training, with a focus on European integration and European Union foreign policy and strategy. Can you still hear me? Yeah. No, it's still working, I guess. Okay. So initially I wanted to start with the Ukrainian war, but we heard much so already. So let's make a quick round to all of you and maybe start with Despina here on my right. What surprised you about the digital dimension in the Russian-Ukrainian war, whether it's disinformation, whether it's hacktivists, whether it's the cyber dimension or the lack of the cyber dimension?
Thank you, and allow me to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, thank Peter Moring, the Munich Security Conference. It is wonderful to be back, and I think at this point in time it was necessary. It's not just delightful because we see each other again, but it's because it's important we start talking. This is a question for a historian who has to tell us in which wars we had surprises or not. My personal view is that in a war situation, nothing is a surprise. So I think you may hear views saying, well, we expected huge cyber attacks or not. I wouldn't go there. I think what will be a surprise will be an outcome in our collaboration. I come here to what President Ilves said very correctly towards the end of his intervention, his brilliant intervention. If we don't learn lessons from this in collaborating more for these occasions when this happens, I think what surprised us all is that we have identified once again, we do not have mechanisms for working together. We don't have a coalition of not only of the willing, but of the good, of those that are like-minded. And we find ourselves sharing information very old style. And in Europe, we have been trying to establish the relevant mechanisms, and they start to work, but we're still not there. And it should not just happen in Europe. In Europe, we have a privilege. We are 27 countries that work together, and you saw that when it came to the Ukrainian war, one of our biggest strengths was the solidarity between us, and that solidarity transcends down to cyber issues, so we see more exchanges, we see more collaboration, that is for sure, but it shouldn't just be about inside the European Union. We have to go further. We need to work with other jurisdictions, as I mentioned, the like-minded, and for me, what will be a surprise is if we keep on forgetting to do this, working together to deal with our issues. We know that there is cyber warfare happening. We heard a lot of facts. We know, and those who work inside cybersecurity know even more, that there are people out there, hacktivism is at its highest probably that we have seen. We have hackers for hire. We have pro-warfare people. We have anti-warfare people. We have law enforcement working against all that. All this is happening, and there's great collaboration. But we need geopolitical collaboration. And the surprise will be if we don't do that.
The surprise will be if we can maintain it in the long run, but we will see. So Eva, did you expect a cyber Pearl Harbor, or were your expectations more muted with regard to cyber activity in the conflict?
Well, I think from the region where I come, and I come from Latvia and my husband from Estonia, basically I think nothing was a surprise to us. We are used to live next door to Russia. And I think everything that we build and everything that we do in our countries, we always keep that in background. Should it be economy, should it be military, or should it be any digital solution? And we have to say also that Baltic states are very advanced in digital, so in no way that has stopped us to be digitally well connected, putting services online, making everything digitally available, yet I think we have been building that, constantly thinking who is our neighbor and what temptations that neighbor might have also in digital realm. So that doesn't come as a surprise, what's happening. As we know, anything that happens in real life actually is mirrored in digital. In one or another way, we see digital events accompanying. To what extent? I actually think we can do much better, and we have to do much more on cybersecurity, but I think we can also take a bit of credit. Certainly in all Baltic states, we have seen a very extensive sort of a search and looking for vulnerabilities, for flaws. We have seen and experienced attempts to attack, and we have been rather resilient to withstand. So I think the same could be said about Ukraine. I think from the first invasion of Russia, they have actually done a rather good job. And we might also assume that as in many domains, Russia actually is doing a floppy job and not very good organized, not very well structured, and actually not delivering even if technically they could.
Maybe the question whether someone is surprised by the activity or the lack of activity depends on the region where you're located, and I'm pretty sure that the Baltic states are, at the front lines in this domain and therefore have different sets of experiences, as we have maybe in Germany, who are a little bit late in the game, I might add, ironically. So, Caroline, what's your assessment from the German side of things?
Most of what we saw in terms of, I'll speak more about the disinformation than the cyber aspect, there has been nothing new because we've seen that Ukraine has been someone called it a petri dish for Russia for a long time. So all the disinformation campaigns that we're seeing right now, they have been there before. If anything, it has increased in, let's say, craziness. The tone has become harsher. I would say the gloves are off. What surprised me personally the most was the fact or the suspicion to what extent Russia disinformed itself. Because in some ways, I cannot help but feel that they fell for their own lies. I mean, they've been in Ukraine's networks for such a long time. They should know the region. They should know how the people work. But they keep repeating their own lies, saying that Ukraine is not a proper nation. They will welcome Russians once we get there. It will be so easy to take Kiev within a couple of days. And as I said, I cannot help but wonder whether Putin and his establishment, and it's probably very hard to tell because we don't have an insight into his inner circle, but to what extent they fell for their own lies. And that surprised me the most, that they haven't been prepared better.
Or they prepared, or they had the strategy or they had the wrong strategy of a quick win. And in terms of strategy, Paul, you're the expert in strategy. What's your take on the miscalculation dimension here?
Yeah, and I'll take it from the geopolitics side, and thank you very much for the invitation, by the way. And probably it's the nature of conflict that has made the most, or has taken most of my time in terms of researching about the conflict. And of course, the cyber warfare preceded the actual war, and we had been studying about the evolving nature of conflict for a long time. And particularly in the 90s and the 2000s, when we thought that what mattered was the erosion of the boundaries of conflict in international affairs, right? We had studied for so long, and Mary Kaldor's New Wars book was perhaps the clearest example of that, how warring parties were blurring, how civilians were the main target, how ethnic reasons behind the conflict were on the rise, how socioeconomic conditions were also at the roots of the conflict. And basically what we've come up to realize is that we are back to very traditional forms of waging war, but also very traditional reasoning behind the war that we are witnessing now. And probably I would say that what we are witnessing today is the comeback of geopolitics in conflict, and I would say even worse than that, the combination of these eroding boundaries of conflict that we have been working on for the last decades, combined with geopolitics. And probably what we are witnessing today is the worst of both worlds. The conflict is being eroded. There are multiple sources of conflict, multiple reasonings for conflict, multiple ways of waging war, from cyber to actual war. But in addition to that, with an upper layer of geopolitical dimension of the conflict that I think that when we look back in time to the Ukraine war, we will put this war as the beginning of a new era. Hopefully, it will be an exception to what's to come. I really hope so in historical terms. But for the time being, we have to be very careful on the combination of these eroding boundaries of conflict and the geopoliticization, sorry for the long word, of conflict.
So let's take this thesis of the return of the traditional war and wrap it around a little bit on the panel. Some observers in the cyber scholar community, they said, okay, maybe one of the explanations for the lack of cyber activity, or rather destructive cyber activity in terms of conventional or physical effects, is the pure fact that you can do the same stuff with rockets, but way cheaper and way more effective. So the return of the conventional weapon superior to the cyber dimension. Would Eva, maybe, what's your thought on this? Is it return of the traditional, or should we go back to traditional analog tanks, or does the cyber or digital dimension still has a role to play?
Well, I think it's inseparable, and I actually wouldn't also rush maybe to judge, because there is a real war going on on the grounds, and I imagine it's really hard to ask Ukrainians to provide us an assessment of how they are doing and what's going on, because I think they really are fighting a real life for life. So I think I wouldn't agree that there haven't been attempts. We have seen that they try to crash communication. You know, that's where we have the famous Elon Musk stepping in with Starlinks. We've seen that they tried to get into electrical grids. So it's clearly there were attempts. So I think it's clear that digital is there to stay, and the cyber attacks and sort of a domain as for war, it will stay. So it's just a question whether we will learn fast and whether we will advance ourselves from that learning, from this conflict, much quicker in this sort of horizontal way between all the democratic countries. The format's been mentioned a couple of times. I also want to mention we have this initiative under President Biden to have a democracy summit, I think, which is again bringing together those countries who stand by certain values and want to defend them also in the digital domain. So I think the threats are there to stay. The question is, will we be better prepared to stand as good as we do it now, at least as good as we do it now?
Yes, certainly, and we cannot completely rule out that in the future we might face an antagonist who is a little bit more competent of, integrating cyber and conventional military capabilities. So we cannot rule this out completely. Speaking of failures a little bit more, some observers argued that the Russians lost the information war quite early on, winning the hearts and minds, because the international community, or at least as it seemed from our Western perspective, was quickly aligned with Ukraine and the messages coming out of Kiev of President Zelensky with his social media feeds and his smartphones debunking lies and misinformation and disinformation, and being pretty active in the meme space. You probably heard about legend stories of Snake Island. You've seen the warship stamp that has been printed, which is all strategic communication. What's your assessment on the information angle? Did Russia lose the information war, or is it just a faulty perspective because we were not the target?
I think it's a bit too early to tell, but I don't think that there are real winners in this side. And as you said, the right term to use is from our perspective, because we all live in our own bubbles, and we get those media that are mostly tailored to us. So from our Western perspective, looking at Zelensky, the charismatic leader, in his green T-shirt, streamlining out of Ukraine, Kiev, that certainly gave us a very good impression. He did a great job. On this side, he was winning, but I would, if we look towards Russia, for instance, I think the picture is very different. It's very bleak because Russia has stepped up on state censorship. So everything, all independent media that were still left, they are basically banned, and you cannot talk about the war other than in Putin's own or the government line. So I would say for the Russian people, I mean, depends again on the perspective. The Russians are losing out because they only get their own perspective. But here, Putin thus far is rather successful because he's only selling his lies to his own people. I would say that there was also a very interesting development on the international level that we could observe in this conflict. And that goes to your point also about international collaboration. So prior to the war, we had a really unprecedented effort by the US government to make public intelligence and declassify intelligence in order to share it with the world and thus frustrate Russia's narrative of being the victims in this war here, and they just had to defend themselves. And that's something that is really interesting to watch because it's taking this information warfare to a global level. It's too early to speak of something like an information world war, but I think we're seeing a dynamic here, and you also mentioned a similar point, that the war, it's not contained in Ukraine, but it's spreading across the borders, and it depends very much on in which kind of bubble you are, what you're seeing, but it's it's taking on a very international dynamic, and I think that we will see a lot more of this type of, or we need to see a lot more of this type of cooperation and intelligence sharing, and also declassifying intelligence to make it public, to give transparency in order to address this Russian disinformation.
We'll come to strategies for tackling disinformation in a while, but let's go back to the geopolitics and strategy and higher level questions. Security experts say that we have entered a new phase of competition with Russia. We in Germany, we liked the idea that we could build a cooperative security architecture together with Russia. And this whole architecture crumbled with the invasion. The latest, of course, there were signs earlier, Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014. So as I mentioned, we are a little bit late to the game. But we are in the phase of a new security architecture that is evolving, that is to be more antagonistic rather than cooperative. So how do you think, Paul, this new security architecture that is being developed right now will play out, and what the cyber dimension will play in this, or what role the cyber dimension will play in this architecture?
It's a broad question, but 3 quick points on this that I think are quite important. First of all, the acknowledgement that what used to unite us now is tearing us apart, right? And that, I think, is quite crucial to understand why this war is being waged on the idea that there is a return to... Is everything all right?
There was a small mouse, for those of you who couldn't see it.
Okay.
Maybe a drone mouse, yeah.
All right. Right. Okay. Okay. Since I am facing you, I didn't see it.
Please.
So let me go back to the idea.
Sure.
Now it will be very difficult to catch people's attention,
Indeed.
but I will do my best. So I was saying what used to unite us, and now it's tearing us apart, and that means that we are being confronted in this war now to a clear return of power dynamics at the international scene, combined with interconnectedness, right? So you cannot understand one without the other. It's both playing at the same time. And the long-standing assumptions that we had on economic cooperation, energy cooperation, inclusion within the rules-based order, and so on, are precisely denied by the fact that power politics overcomes everything that we are witnessing now. So this is my first point. And here, connectivity, of course, is part of the geopolitical game. Second point, on the geopolitical confrontation, then what we are seeing is that every tool, including technology, including cyber, is used for geopolitical purposes. So every actor who wants to be a geopolitical actor has to equip itself with a broad range of tools that go way beyond its regulatory power, for instance. And that is the case for the European Union. Very strong regulatory power, but not enough in this geopolitical competition. And there's usually a parallel made here between regulating by the EU in technology and regulating the single market. Well, listen, single market was also about capabilities. You had the industries, you had the economy to rule for the rest of the world. In the digital domain, in the technological domain, you also need to build capabilities, you also need to build innovation practices, R&D, European digital champions. There are many more things than regulatory power that I think go together if you want to be a geopolitical actor. And third, and very quick, I think that the debates on security today are very tangible. They are not theoretical anymore. They are not about conceptions on security. They are not conceptions about the world we live in. They are conceptions about the way to tackle shared security concerns, problems, and threats. And then concepts that emanated from these more theoretical understandings of security in Europe, such as strategic autonomy, for instance, have become very tangible as well. And they are based on the idea that you need to cooperate and you need to be complementary to what others are doing if you want to secure your place. And when I mean your place, I mean the European Union's place in this more geopolitical contest.
Thank you so much. Despina, I think you might want to respond to that, because there was a lot put on the table regarding how do we do, what do we do with actors who don't believe in the rules-based orders. The European Union does believe in the rules-based order very much. Its whole cyber diplomacy is based on this concept. So what's your reply to Paul in this assessment?
Well, first of all, I'm very amused by the little friend that joined us in the room. I think Europe is known for having been built on norms and laws. It started as an internal market, but the internal market represents values. So the whole of the EU represents the value of peace and security, and we defend our values with laws. This is the approach we have taken, and we have been evolving in our laws. And I would not call the NIS technical standards. I mean, I would call the NIS fundamental because it is a piece of legislation, and as you know, it is currently being in the negotiation table for updates that ensures that all critical infrastructure meets high cybersecurity standards. That's not technical, that's strategic. And we have moved from the current law that says you protect your usual critical infrastructures, your energy sector, banking, financial, health, etc., transport, to also some industries. And imagine we designed this proposal before COVID hit, and of course, healthcare, medical devices are all in there. Food industry is in there. So all the industries that are critical for the operation of our society. It's as if we knew the crisis that hit us the last 2 years were coming. Because if they stop operating, then we have a problem. And we matched this with an ambition to become more operational. In Europe, we worked a lot on preparedness, on resilience, with the NIS, with our laws on certification, etc. But we have also committed in the new Commission, and this was a commitment of President von der Leyen already at the very beginning of the mandate, to create a so-called joint cyber unit that is still under discussion. But this shows our approach of becoming more operational. We need to make sure we join forces, we join all our energy and powers that we have as 27 member states with one cybersecurity policy. And the question is how? We have had a number of discussions by ministers on a technical level that show it is difficult to gain enough trust for people to say, if you face a cyber attack, you can take my guys and they can come to help you and fix it. That happens at some level with some countries, at the bilateral understanding. We wanted to create, if you like, a reserve list of cybersecurity professionals that in case of a big cross-border attack would be able to help each other. The problem is that which member state that is suffering will want to lend to another one their forces. And we know that there is great inequalities between member states when it comes to cybersecurity experts. and an overall problem of skill shortage in the field, especially in the public administration, because it doesn't pay as much as the private sector. Let's be frank. So this is why we're now reflecting how to create this reserve, if you like. How can we create in Europe this solidarity approach that we demonstrated also in this war on the operational side? This is what we're missing. We have the legal framework, we have the diplomacy toolbox. It didn't lead us very far in this case. We have a sanctions regime for cybersecurity, but their attribution makes it very hard to implement because it's difficult to agree on attribution. Attribution on its own is very difficult. And now we need some operational, we need to move to what we call cyber defense. Because in Europe, we took an approach until now that distinguished something that in my view is undistinguishable, civilian and defense cybersecurity. It is now time to see how the two can work together.
Right. Okay, so some people argue that we in the European Union have, or no, not even in the European Union, but maybe within the Western Alliance in general, have a strategic gap regarding gray zone activity because, or activity below the conventional threshold of an armed attack, which is the legal threshold for NATO's Article 5 to be triggered as a response, for example, for a devastating cyber attack, or even the European Union Solidarity Clause might come in this regard. But the problem is that most of the activities that we see in the cyber domain stays below this threshold of activity. What we have in the European Union is the cyber diplomacy toolbox, which also includes restrictive measures such as sanctions, and we used these sanctions in the past against APT 28 and 29, and sanctions put some restriction, travel bans and some asset freezes on some Russian operatives. The question is if they feel really threatened by that, if they cannot come to the European Union anymore. So some people argue that this is not enough to fill the gap that is below the threshold of an armed attack, but still higher than what these restrictive measures try to achieve. Or maybe to create some sort of deterrence. And a question maybe to all of you, do you agree with this assessment that we have this strategic gap, or is it just, you know, armchair strategist discussion in the academic journals? Maybe, Despina, you...
I don't want to speak all the time myself. I think that there is a gap also because of different approaches across the world. Again, I mentioned Europe. In the US, we saw a fantastic race to create standards after the colonial pipeline incident, and now we have directive after directive on reporting incidents, something that in Europe we did with the NIS directive already 5 years ago. I think now people are there is a certain convergence that is coming up in the approaches, and I think that convergence will be achieved with what I mentioned earlier, more collaboration. And there we will reach this strategic, we will cover the strategic gap that you mentioned.
I think I'm coming from a small state, living in a dangerous sort of geographical location. I think where there is a will, there is a way. So I don't think that we are in such a sort of a gap. I think actually if there is a will, and that will, if we can put together that will as minimum between two coasts of Atlantic Ocean, and we stop quarreling between ourselves about some minor issues. I think if there's one thing, another one thing that the war in Ukraine has done, I think good in the sense that it has put aside all kind of little things and brought a bigger perspective back on the table, that we actually share more, that we argue about more. So I think I don't see that as a disadvantage. I think we have a lot of opportunities to do. I think we do need that regulation because that's just the way of how democratic countries cooperate and operate. And we have all these regulations in pipeline. We saw, I think, one very small example, Digital Service Act. I think last minute change, the conflict situation will be added in so that there is a possibility to react quickly if necessary, because technologies evolve, conflicts change, and we have to have tools and legal means to operate. So we have these capacities sort of from legal perspective, and I think we also have finances. So Europe set a course to invest a lot in digital development. What I would like to see, it said, I think from Recovery Fund, it was 20% of that whole money should go into digital. So I really hope that now these digital investments will also have almost like a mandatory percentage that anything that you build digitally has to have, I don't know, 10, 15% costs invested in security, because we should start, like the question is, how do you integrate that security in everyday digital solutions that keep upcoming and building? We have to make it much stronger effort that security is part. So I'm rather optimistic. I think that we have all tools on table, financial, legal, and I think we have really motivation. If we don't have an incentive right now, looking at Ukraine, what's going on, when else at both coasts, at least, of Atlantic or among democratic community, we would be able to actually really get our will together to act.
So, Caroline and Paul, do you share this optimism that we might fill this gap?
To go back to the question you said before, in 2019, the German then Chief of Defense for the Cyber and Information Domain, General Leinhaus, he said that in Germany we would need something which he called a digital state of defense. And I found this a really good suggestion. I'm not saying that I'm for it. There are pros and cons. Some people would say it's absolutely necessary. Some people say, well, we don't need it. But the point is, it was not a debate in Germany. No one discussed it, and if you Google it, it has a hit, maybe 20, 30, 2, I don't know. But I was really surprised. No one picked it up, no one really reported on it, and after a while, everyone forgot it. And the reason why I think we need this debate and why we should at least discuss the possibility is, so when the war in Ukraine started, I talked to a friend of mine with whom I attended school, and she's not in this security business, and she told me, I was living in my pink world and I woke up and it was awful. I did not expect this. How did it come to that? And what I think a digital state of defense would do, at least, it would raise awareness among Germans that we are under attack, even if we're not attacked by armed force. There are forces that are trying to dissect our society, to dissect the fabrics of our society. I mean, there are families in Germany who have Russian background, and they discuss the question of who is right. Is Russia right? Has Russia been a victim? Is Ukraine a victim? And I think this entire contested information space that we have, that has become so toxic with disinformation, I think we need much better awareness, at least in Germany. I think it's very different in the Eastern European nations. They have a much better threat assessment. But in Germany, at least, I think it wouldn't be bad to follow up Olaf Scholz's Zeitenwende and to at least discuss mechanisms that are below the threshold of a state of defense, and that would allow us to defend ourselves much better against this malign influence.
Yeah, on whether I am optimistic or not on threat perception, strategic threat perception. Well, the traditional gap, I think, has been not closed but narrowed when it comes to the understanding of what Ukraine means for the whole of Europe. And speaking from a Spanish perspective, of course, the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs likes to say that at the time when the Russians realized that a country that is far away, that tends to see the conflicts in the east as not affecting direct security to Spain, and also that is traditionally or that acknowledges the need to speak to Russia because it's a big power. Well, at the moment that Spain was taking the risk seriously and that was being one of the first countries to be very proactive in the EU response, then that helped also in the eyes of Russia to see that this was serious. This is what the ministry likes to say. And be that true or not, we will study it in a few years' time, what is certainly the case is that for the time being, and as we speak, this strategic gap, this threat perception has narrowed across Europe. And that is a positive sign. It is an optimistic view. But however, when it comes to the long-standing trends in EU foreign policy and the strategy of the European Union, we're still suffering more or less from the same ills that we have had over the time, right? Now we are in extraordinary circumstances and we've acted fast and coherently. But the truth is that the coherence of the different tools that we have at our external action domain, and that includes cyber, but it includes military, and it includes development cooperation, or it includes energy and aid, all the policies that you can name, of course the coherence is still low. It's very difficult to bring them together under a same strategic direction. Second, the alignment of interests is still deficitary. I mean, it's still very different when you speak to a German audience than when you speak to a Spanish audience, right? And when it comes to energy links, when it comes to many aspects. So these interests will disalign or will continue to disalign because they have always been different. And third, when it comes to policy-making mechanisms and institutional arrangements, we are still very much limited by the way we take decisions at the EU level when it comes to foreign policy, defense matters. And now we like to say that qualified majority voting QMV debates are gone because we could adopt sanctions with unanimity, and that, of course, this discussion is not relevant anymore. Well, I would be cautious with that reading, because when these interests start to disalign again, and they are, by the way, starting to disalign already as we speak with the position of Poland and Bulgaria, for instance, or the position of other countries when it comes to the energy, to gas, these interests are starting to disalign. So QMV discussions and the limitations of unanimity will come back as soon as this first strategic alignment that we are witnessing now starts to vanish or starts to be endangered.
Yeah, and we can be pretty sure that antagonistic actors will try to fracture this cohesion even more in the long run. So we have just like 5 more minutes left, and I will end the panel with the question that was the topic of the panel, which is the question: how will geopolitics, oh, there's the mouth again, how will geopolitics reshape the cyber environment? And I just want to go over to Despina once more. What are like the 2 or maybe 3 main mechanisms how you see the relationship of geopolitics and the cyber dimension evolving in the future?
How I see, I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
The 3 causal mechanisms, or the 3 ways in which geopolitics and the cyber dimension will change in the future.
Yes, well, I mean, your question was how will geopolitics reshape cyberspace? I think it also works the other way around. Your power in cyberspace will also determine a lot of the geopolitics. I don't think it is a coincidence that not that long ago Russia had engaged in an exercise to disconnect itself from the internet and to have a self-standing system. So I think the main factors will depend on how, of course, each power decides to invest in cybersecurity. Investment in money is one area. Traditionally, for instance, in the other side of the Atlantic, it was defense that was investing in cybersecurity, and therefore we saw very big investments. In Europe, we take a more fragmented approach. I think if investment grows and if we link more to defense, definitely there we will see a bigger geopolitical game. Joining forces, as I mentioned, for the like-minded, I think that will be a determining power, geopolitically speaking. Again, those that want the good of the world and want to defend what others, malicious actors, may want to do. And of course, maintaining and enhancing our laws. In Europe, we do not intend to stop. we have this fantastic capacity of 27 countries thinking in one mind and going with one approach. We intend to invest in resilience more. You know that we are currently consulting until the 25th of May on the Cyber Resilience Act, and we're very open as to what that may mean, this cyber resilience. We're trying to achieve security by design, starting from product services and going where have you, and I think that will largely depend on what responses we get. Investing on more operational, again, this is the next step where we see Europe creating forces that can help in case of cyber attack, so managing cyber attacks and response by joint public-private partnerships maybe, and why not also transatlantic or more global relations and alliances.
Eva, next to you.
I'm thinking in a global terms. I think what COVID did, we kind of moved from one global crisis, health crisis, into sort of a new one. And though the war is geographically kind of limited, it's Russia attacking or invading Ukraine, but the conflict we have a global in terms of with Russia, at least between democratic states. So what we've seen that COVID accelerated the digitization. It was kind of a side effect of COVID. I think what I think will come from this war as a side effect that we will see acceleration of cybersecurity, and it will have many forms and ways. But I'm very confident that that's what will happen. We'll see more investments. We might see more regulations, standards. I mean, anything that helps. I also looking forward to see that a business market in itself sees an opportunity to develop new products, and there is a potential for business and profit as sort of the general awareness of cyber threat and risk has, I think, tremendously gone up. So I think with cybersecurity, I'm more optimistic. I think we see what needs to be done, and I think it will be accelerated. I think information space is more complicated topic, and I think that I hope will open more creative, more honest discussions on what to do with this information space. I think that field, I don't see the answers yet. I see that the questions are big and bold, but we don't have answers comparing to cybersecurity.
But for answers, we have Caroline, so no problem.
Thank you. How do we rebuild trust after it's been shattered? I mean, trust is obviously it's at a low point right now between, let's say, the West and Russia, and to some extent China on the other hand. But in the apps, while we won't rebuild trust now between those sides, but what we can do is do our homework, and that's what I think we need to get better at. And there are a couple of things that we can do. I mean, Russia is pursuing, obviously, a long-term strategy, and the most obvious answer is also a long-term strategy to, namely, invest more in education and also digital education. I don't know about other nations, they are probably more advanced, but in Germany, at least, we can improve digital education a lot more, teach our children that the internet is a contested space and that not everything that they see is correct. In fact, the opposite. And then also, I think we should invest more in analysis capabilities, and that's where I see some interesting trends. Because a couple of years ago, when the military discovered social media, for instance, situation awareness, there were a lot of companies who were able to provide such services and who were able to analyze social media, do data mining, all that type of things. And a lot of them, back then, it wasn't really, I would say, it wasn't really sexy. And a lot of them were discredited by scandals like Cambridge Analytica, where we saw election meddling. And a lot of them didn't really want to go public. Right now, I kind of have the feeling that a lot of companies are saying, yeah, of course we need to analyze social media because we need to detect disinformation. We're doing societies a service because we're not interested in earlier we talked about privacy. We're not interested in the individual, but we're interested in tracking disinformation and shedding a light on it. So I think that's something where we also have a lot of work to do.
Excellent. Paul, super quick, because we're eating away people's coffee break and the people look decaffeinated.
Time is up, and I'll be very brief to answer to your question with 3 C's that I think are very important, and an M in the mouse. C, number 1, capabilities. As I said before, it's about capabilities. Second, it's about coherence of the tools that we put at our disposal if we really want to speak the language of power or to be a geopolitical union. And third, confidence or trust, as the title of the conference puts it, in terms of the regulations that we put forward, the standards that we set, the responsiveness to the threats that we identify. We must deal with them under a confidence mindset.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, dear guests and speakers, for discussing here with us. We hope you take something away to discuss in the break. Enjoy your coffee and see you in the next panel.